I signed my name on the last line of paperwork and slid the clipboard back across the metal desk. The dispatcher barely looked up from their computer screen, already moving on to the next driver's assignment. The freight depot buzzed with its usual morning chaos, trucks backing up to loading docks, hydraulic lifts groaning under cargo weight, drivers shouting over the noise of diesel engines. "Seattle run," I said, more to myself than anyone else. The paperwork felt heavier than it should have in my hands. 3 days' worth of driving compressed into 2, with a route that most guys in this business wouldn't touch for any amount of money. The thin highway was printed in small letters at the bottom of the manifest, like the dispatchers hoped you might miss it buried in the fine print. Triple rate for that stretch alone. I'd driven it 4 times over the past decade, and each trip had taken something out of me that regular highways never could. I folded the papers and shoved them into my jacket pocket, then walked back toward my rig. The morning air carried the smell of diesel exhaust and hot asphalt. Kansas City spread out beyond the depot's chain-link fence, but my mind was already calculating miles and hours, mapping out the route that would take us through Kansas, Colorado, and then into the stretch of road that existed somewhere between Wyoming and nowhere at all. Andy's beat-up Honda was parked next to my truck when I reached the loading area. The kid had been early, as usual. He stood beside the passenger door of my Peterbilt, hands jammed into his jacket pockets, moving his weight from one foot to the other. His nervousness came off him like heat from pavement. "Morning, Leo," he called out when he spotted me approaching. I nodded and unlocked the cab. "You ready for a real education, kid?" "Been ready since you called yesterday." Andy followed me around to the back of the trailer. "You still haven't told me what makes this run so special." The loading crew had already put the cargo in place, machine parts headed for a manufacturing plant outside Seattle. Standard industrial freight, nothing unusual about it. What made the run special had nothing to do with what we were hauling and everything to do with the road we'd be taking to get there. "Some routes pay more because they're longer," I said, checking the load straps and making sure everything was secured properly. "Some pay more because they're dangerous. This one pays more because most drivers won't take it." Andy climbed up onto the loading dock to get a better look at the cargo. "What kind of dangerous? Bad weather? Mountain passes?" I could have told him right then. Could have explained about the figures you see standing on the roadside, the voices that call your name through the radio static, the way the highway plays with your mind until you're not sure what's real anymore. But Andy needed to understand trucking the way I'd learned it, through experience, not stories that would sound like the ramblings of a crazy old driver. "The kind that demands respect," I said instead, jumping down from the trailer bed. "You'll see soon enough." We finished the inspection in silence. Andy watched me check every strap, every connection, every moving part that could fail us 2,000 miles from home. He was learning to be thorough, which was good. On the thin highway, mechanical problems weren't just inconvenient. They could be fatal. The CB radio crackled to life when I fired up the engine. Voices of other drivers filled the cab, reporting road conditions, traffic delays, weather updates. Normal trucking chatter that would keep us company for the first half of our journey. After that, the radio would carry different kinds of voices. "We're looking at 36 hours of driving," I told Andy as he buckled his seatbelt. 2 fuel stops, maybe 3 if we push it. No meal breaks, no sightseeing, no detours. When I tell you to do something, you do it without questions. When I tell you not to look at something, you keep your eyes straight ahead. Understood? Andy's face went pale, but he nodded. "What aren't we supposed to look at?" I moved into gear and pulled away from the loading dock. The GPS display showed our route, a thin line stretching across the map from Missouri to Washington. Most of it looked like any other interstate highway. One section in the middle showed up as a faint gray line, barely visible on the screen. "Everything," I said, turning onto the street that would take us to I-70 West. On certain stretches of this route, you don't look at anything except the road directly in front of us. You don't wave at other drivers. You don't acknowledge pedestrians. You sure as hell don't respond if someone calls your name. The city fell away behind us as we merged onto the interstate. Andy sat quietly for the first few miles, processing what I'd told him. He was smart enough to know there was more to the story, but also smart enough not to push for details I wasn't ready to give. "How long have you been driving routes like this?" he finally asked. "Long enough to know the rules." I adjusted my mirrors and settled into the driving rhythm that would carry us across 4 states. Long enough to know what happens when you break them. The highway stretched ahead of us, normal concrete and asphalt that looked the same as every other interstate in America. For the next several hours, it would be exactly that. Just another road taking us west toward where we were going. But somewhere past the Colorado border, the thin highway would begin, and Andy would learn why some roads paid triple rate for good reason. I reached for the thermos of coffee I'd filled at the depot and took a long drink. The caffeine would be important later, when staying alert meant the difference between completing the delivery and becoming another story talked about among drivers who knew better than to take certain jobs. Andy pulled out his phone and started scrolling through messages, probably texting friends or family to let them know he'd left Kansas City safely. In a few hours, I'd have to tell him to turn the phone off completely. The thin highway had ways of using personal connections against you. And the less it knew about Andy's life, the better his chances of making it to Seattle with his mind in one piece. The morning sun climbed higher as we rolled west through Kansas, leaving the freight depot and the ordinary world behind us. My hands had found their familiar position on the steering wheel hours ago, settled into the rhythm that carried us across Kansas and into Colorado without any trouble. The regular interstate had treated us well. Smooth asphalt, normal traffic, the kind of driving that made trucking feel like any other job. Andy had relaxed somewhere around Hays, Kansas, even dozed off for a stretch while I navigated through Denver's afternoon congestion. Now the GPS showed us approaching the Wyoming border, and that familiar knot started forming in my chest. The landscape had changed from rolling plains to something more empty, with long stretches between towns and fewer vehicles sharing the road. Gas stations became truck stops, then just scattered buildings, then nothing but fence posts and empty rangeland. I spotted the blue sign ahead, last services for 50 miles. The truck stop looked exactly like it had on my previous runs. A worn building with 2 fuel islands, a few parking spaces for cars, and a small diner with windows that reflected the late afternoon sky. The neon sign advertising hot coffee and fresh sandwiches flashed against the growing dusk. "Fuel stop," I announced, pulling into the diesel lane. Andy stretched and looked around as I shut down the engine. "Middle of nowhere, huh? Last chance to use a real bathroom for a while." I climbed down from the cab and started the refueling process. The diesel pump made its familiar mechanical sounds, but everything else was too quiet. No other trucks, no cars pulling in for gas, just wind moving across the empty parking lot and the distant hum of electrical lines. Andy walked around to stretch his legs while I filled the tank. He pointed toward a cluster of buildings maybe half a mile off the highway. "What's that place?" "Nothing you need to worry about." I finished fueling and walked over to where Andy stood looking at the horizon. "Listen, kid. We're about to hit a different kind of road. The kind I've been preparing you for since Kansas City." His expression shifted from casual curiosity to something more alert. "The dangerous stretch?" "Exactly." I pulled out my wallet and handed him a $20 bill. "Go inside and buy whatever snacks you want. Use the restroom. When we get back in that truck, we're not stopping again until we reach the other side." Andy took the money but didn't move toward the store. "How long is this stretch?" "About 8 hours if we push it. Maybe 10 if we take it careful." I looked at the road ahead, where the interstate disappeared into rolling hills that seemed to swallow the asphalt. "There's something you need to understand before we go any further." We walked back to the truck, and I leaned against the front bumper, while Andy waited for me to continue. The air had picked up, carrying a chill that didn't match the season. Our diesel fumes mixed with something else something that reminded me of old houses and wet earth. "The first rule," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "If you see someone on the highway ahead of us, you ignore them completely. Don't point, don't wave, don't even look directly at them. There shouldn't be anyone out there walking around, so if you see someone, they're not real." Andy's face went through several expressions: confusion, skepticism, then a kind of nervous understanding. Not real how? Just not real. I pushed off from the bumper and headed toward the store. "Get your snacks, use the bathroom, and remember what I told you." 20 minutes later, we were back on the road, heading into the stretch where the interstate map showed a thin gray line instead of the bold black marking of normal highways. Andy had bought a bag of trail mix and a large coffee, both of which he held in his lap. The CB radio continued its normal chatter for the first few miles, but I could feel the change coming. The landscape grew stranger as we drove. Hills that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Fence lines that ran in directions that didn't make sense. Road signs that appeared normal from a distance but became unreadable when we got close enough to actually see them clearly. Andy hadn't noticed yet. He was looking out the passenger window, watching the scenery roll past like any other highway in America. I checked my watch. We'd been on the thin highway for maybe 25 minutes. "Leo," Andy said suddenly, his voice sharp with confusion. "There's a woman standing over there." I kept my eyes straight ahead, hands steady on the wheel. "Where?" "Right there on the shoulder. She's wearing a white dress and she's waving at us." Andy started to roll down his window. "Should we stop? Maybe she needs help." "No." I reached over and grabbed his wrist before he could get the window more than an inch down. Eyes forward, "Don't look at her." "But she's right there, and she looks like she's in trouble." Andy twisted in his seat, trying to get a better view. "Leo, she's really waving at us." "Andy." My voice came out harder than I intended. "Look at me, not out there." He turned toward me, his face full of questions and worry. "I don't understand. There's clearly someone who needs help." "There's no one there." I checked my mirrors. Empty road behind us, empty road ahead. "What you're seeing isn't real. It's the highway playing tricks." Andy looked back toward the shoulder, then at me again. "Playing tricks how? I can see her clearly. She's got long dark hair and she's wearing white and she's definitely waving." The CB radio started crackling with static. Not the normal kind that happened when signals got weak, but a pattern that sounded almost like words if you listened too carefully. I reached over and turned the volume down. "Keep your eyes on the road ahead," I said. "Whatever you think you're seeing, ignore it." Andy gripped the armrest of his seat. There's an old man now, sitting on a suitcase beside the road. "Leo, these are real people." "They're not real." I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching our speed climb to 75, then 80. "This is what I was trying to prepare you for. The highway does things to your mind. My mind is fine." Andy's voice carried a note of panic now. "There's another one. A kid on a bicycle just standing there watching us drive past." The temperature in the cab had dropped at least 10 degrees. I could see Andy's breath when he spoke, and my hands felt stiff on the steering wheel. The CB radio's static got louder even with the turned down volume, and I started catching fragments that sounded like voices calling from very far away. "Why can I see them and you can't?" Andy asked, his knuckles white where he gripped the seat. "I don't know." It was the truth. On my previous runs, I'd seen the figures too, but always different ones than whatever passenger I was carrying. The highway seemed to customize its torments for each person individually. What I do know is that acknowledging them makes everything worse. Andy pulled his hands away from the window and pressed them against his face. "This doesn't make sense. People don't just appear and disappear. On this road, they do." I checked our GPS. Still 6 hours of thin highway ahead of us. "You have to trust me on this, kid. Whatever you see out there, whatever calls to you or waves at you or looks like it needs help, you ignore it completely." The static from the CB radio had become a constant background noise now, occasionally making patterns that almost sounded like music or conversation. Andy sat stiff in his seat, hands pressed over his eyes, trying not to look at whatever figures the highway was showing him. I pushed our speed up to 85 and tried to focus on the road ahead. The sooner we got through this section, the sooner Andy could start processing what he'd experienced. But I knew from my previous runs that we'd barely started. The figures walking along the roadside were just the highway's way of getting warmed up. Andy took his hands away from his face and looked at me with an expression I'd seen before on other passengers' faces. Fear mixed with confusion. The look of someone whose understanding of reality had just taken a serious hit. "Leo," he said quietly, "what kind of road is this?" "The kind that pays triple rate," I replied, keeping my eyes straight ahead as the thin highway carried us deeper into the darkness that existed between Wyoming and nowhere at all. My watch showed we'd been on the thin highway for just over 2 hours when Andy's posture changed in the passenger seat. He'd been sitting with his hands pressed against his legs, on purpose not looking out the side windows after the parade of figures he'd seen along the shoulder. But now he was staring straight ahead through the windshield, his body going completely still. "Leo," he said, his voice tight, "there's someone standing in the road." I followed his look and felt ice flood my veins. A man in a wide-brimmed hat stood directly in our lane about a quarter-mile ahead, still as a statue. Unlike the figures Andy had seen walking along the roadside, this one wasn't trying to hide or blend into the side areas. It was positioned exactly where we needed to drive, forcing a confrontation. The highway had marked Andy as its target. "Second rule," I said quickly, checking our speed. We were doing 80 and I wasn't slowing down. "Never stare at anything for longer than 5 seconds or you'll get stuck." But Andy was already locked onto the figure, his eyes wide and unblinking. His breathing had become shallow, and his hands were gripping his knees so hard his knuckles had gone white. The CB radio's static grew louder, filling the cab with crackling noise that sounded almost like whispering. "Andy, look away." I kept my own gaze moving between the road ahead and my mirrors, never focusing on the hat-wearing figure for more than a few seconds at a time. "You need to break eye contact right now." The distance closed rapidly. 300 yards became 200, then 100. The figure never moved, never changed position, just stood there waiting for us to reach it. Andy's breathing had become so quiet I could barely hear it over the engine noise. At 50 yards, I could make out details that made my stomach drop. The man's face was becoming clearer, and the features were wrong in a way that made perfect, terrible sense. The nose was too known, the jawline too recognizable. The highway was showing Andy exactly what would hurt him most. "Oh God," Andy whispered, and I heard the recognition in his voice. Dad? His father. Dead 3 years, according to the paperwork I'd seen when Andy first started riding with me. The highway had reached into his memories and pulled out the one person guaranteed to paralyze him with grief and longing. "Andy!" I shouted his name and reached over to shake his shoulder, but he didn't respond. His eyes were completely fixed on the figure ahead, and his body had gone rigid like he'd been shocked. His chest barely moved with each breath. 25 yards. The truck moved slightly toward the shoulder as I tried to steer with one hand while grabbing Andy's arm with the other. The figure's mouth was moving now, like it was calling out words we couldn't hear through the windshield. Andy's lips moved in response, forming shapes I couldn't make out. "Kid, you need to snap out of this right now." I shook him harder, but it was like trying to wake someone from a coma. His consciousness was completely locked onto whatever the highway was showing him through that figure. 10 yards. I could see every detail of the man's face now, and he looked just like Andy. Same nose, same chin, same eyes that Andy got along with his stubborn streak and nervous energy. The figure raised one hand in a way that could have been a wave or a plea for help. The truck went farther right as I lost focus on steering. I pulled the wheel back toward center and made a decision that went against every instinct I had about treating passengers gently. I slapped Andy hard across the face. His head snapped to the side and he gasped like someone surfacing from deep water. His eyes lost their fixed stare and darted around the cab in confusion. We passed through the figure at that exact moment, and I felt the usual sensation of driving through thick fog mixed with something that might have been static electricity. Andy sucked in air like he'd been holding his breath for minutes. His hands flew to his face, covering his eyes as his breathing turned rapid and shallow. He was hyperventilating, his whole body shaking in the passenger seat. Why did I see my father? The words came out between gasps. He's been dead for 3 years. Why was he standing in the road? I checked my mirrors. Empty highway behind us. No sign of the figure we'd just driven through. Andy's breathing was getting worse. The kind of panic attack that could make someone pass out if it wasn't controlled. I reached over and pulled his hands away from his face. Look at me, Andy. Look right at me, not out the windows. His eyes met mine, wide with fear and confusion. Tears had started flowing down his cheeks, but his breathing began to slow slightly. The highway uses personal connections to trap people, I said, keeping my voice steady and matter-of-fact. It reaches into your memories and finds the people who matter most to you. Your father, your mother, friends, anyone who could make you stop thinking clearly. But it looked exactly like him. Andy wiped his face with his sleeve, his hand still trembling. Same clothes he used to wear, same hat. How could it know that? I don't know how it works, just that it does. I focused on the road ahead, where the asphalt stretched into darkness that seemed deeper than normal night. What I do know is that acknowledging those figures, staring at them, responding to them, it gives the highway more power over you. Andy pulled his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms around them. His whole body was still shaking, but the hyperventilating had stopped. I couldn't look away. It was like I was frozen. That's what happens when you stare too long. The highway gets its hooks into your mind. I checked our GPS, still over 5 hours of thin highway ahead of us. That's why the rule exists. 5 seconds maximum, then break eye contact. Will I see him again? The honest answer was probably yes. The highway rarely used the same trick twice on the same person, but it had dozens of other ways to exploit the connection it had just found. Andy's relationship with his dead father was now mapped territory, something the road could reference and manipulate for the rest of our journey. Maybe, I said instead, but now you know what to expect. When you see something that makes you want to stare, you count to 5 and look away. No matter what it is, no matter how much it looks like someone you know. Andy pressed his face against his knees. I can't do this for 5 more hours. Yes, you can. I reached into the space between our seats and pulled out a bottle of water, handing it to him. Drink this. Keep your eyes on your hands or the dashboard. We're going to get through this. The CB radio's static had settled back into its usual pattern of almost voices and distant noise. Outside the windows, the thin highway continued carrying us through landscape that moved and changed in ways that defied normal geography. But inside the cab, Andy was learning the same lesson every passenger eventually learned. Survival meant following the rules, even when everything inside you screamed at you to do otherwise. I pressed a little harder on the accelerator and focused on the white lines marking our lane. The highway had shown its hand by targeting Andy directly, which meant the real psychological warfare was just beginning. Andy's water bottle crinkled as he twisted the cap back on, his hands still shaky from seeing his father's figure. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, watching for the next challenge the highway would throw at us. The landscape outside had grown darker, not just from the approaching night, but from something that seemed to soak up light rather than simply lacking it. The first whisper came so quietly I almost missed it. Andy. His name drifted through the cab like it had been carried on a breeze, though both windows were sealed tight. Andy straightened in his seat, his head turning toward the passenger side glass. Did you hear that? He asked. Third rule, I said quickly, before he could focus too much on the sound. If someone calls your name, pretend you didn't hear it. Never respond, never acknowledge it, never even look in the direction it came from. But someone just said my name. Andy pressed his face closer to the window. It sounded like it came from right outside. Nobody's out there. I checked my mirrors again. Empty highway stretching behind us into darkness. The highway is moving to audio now. This is the next phase. The whisper came again, clearer this time and definitely from outside the truck. Andy, honey. Andy jerked like he'd been shocked. His mother's voice, soft and known, calling to him through the night. I watched his face change as recognition hit him. The same wide-eyed look he'd gotten when he saw his father standing in the road. "That's my mom," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "That's exactly how she sounds when she's worried about me." The voice came again, louder now and carrying more urgency. "Andy, please help me. I need you." Andy's hands flew to his ears, pressing his palms flat against his head. His breathing quickened, and I could see him struggling not to respond to the pleading tone in his mother's voice. "How does it know what my mother sounds like?" Andy asked, his words muffled by his hands. "How does it know any of this?" "The road feeds on personal memories and fears," I said, raising my voice to make sure he could hear me clearly. "It pulls information from your mind and uses it against you. That's why only experienced drivers take these jobs. Most people can't handle what the highway shows them." A different voice joined the first, coming from Andy's side of the truck. "Andy? Andy, is that you?" This one was younger, female, with a kind of casual familiarity that suggested a close relationship. Andy's hands pressed harder against his ears. "Sarah," he whispered. "That's my ex-girlfriend. We broke up 8 months ago, but that's definitely her voice." Sarah's voice came again, closer now and filled with what sounded like genuine excitement. "Andy, I've been looking everywhere for you. Please stop. I have something important to tell you." Andy's whole body started shaking. His knees bounced against each other, and I could see him fighting with himself on his face. Every instinct was telling him to respond to the voices he knew, to answer the people calling his name. A third voice joined in, this one higher and more playful. "Andy! Hey, Andy!" "Tommy Rodriguez," Andy said, his voice cracking. "I haven't talked to him since high school graduation. How can the highway know about Tommy?" The voices were getting louder now, coming from multiple directions around the truck. Andy's mother begging for help, Sarah asking him to stop, Tommy calling out like they were kids on a playground again. Other voices joined them, friends, family members, people from Andy's past, all calling his name through the darkness. "Make them stop," Andy said, pressing his hands so hard against his ears I worried he might hurt himself. "Please, Leo, make them stop." I reached over and cranked the CB radio volume up as high as it would go. Static filled the cab, loud enough to partially drown out the voices calling from outside. Then I started talking, keeping my voice steady and conversational. "Transmission maintenance is crucial on long hauls," I said, watching Andy's face for signs that he was listening. "You need to check your fluid levels every 1,000 miles, especially when you're running heavy loads through mountain passes." Andy looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I kept going. "Brake inspection is another thing new drivers neglect. You want to check your brake pads every time you do a pre-trip inspection. Look for uneven wear patterns that might indicate alignment problems." The voices outside grew more upset, more urgent. Andy's mother was crying now, begging him to help her. Sarah was promising that everything would be okay if he just stopped the truck for a minute. Tommy was laughing and asking why Andy was ignoring his old friends. "Tire pressure affects fuel efficiency more than most people realize," I continued, never breaking the rhythm of my monologue. "Underinflated tires can cost you 15% on gas mileage, and overinflated tires wear out faster and give you less traction in wet conditions." Andy's hand slowly moved away from his ears. He was looking at me with confusion and gratitude, using my voice to hold onto while the psychological attack continued outside our windows. The voices changed tactics, becoming more personal and specific. "Andy, remember when you promised to visit me more often?" His mother's voice carried the weight of guilt and disappointment. "You haven't called in 3 weeks. I've been so worried." Andy's face crumpled and I saw him start to reach for the door handle. "Load distribution is critical for vehicle stability," I said louder, trying to cut through the emotional manipulation. "You want your weight balanced front to back, side to side. Uneven loads can cause rollovers, especially on curves or in high winds." "Andy, I forgive you for everything," Sarah's voice whispered. "I understand why you left. Just stop for a minute so we can talk." "Fuel additives can extend engine life," I continued relentlessly. "Anti-gel additives prevent fuel line freezing in winter conditions, and detergent additives help keep your injection system clean." The voices started talking over each other now. A bunch of people Andy knew all calling his name, all promising different things if he would just stop the truck and pay attention to them. His mother offering forgiveness, Sarah promising to get back together, Tommy inviting him to hang out like the old days. Each voice knew exactly what to say to hurt him most. "Andy, why won't you answer me?" His mother's voice broke with what sounded like genuine heartbreak. "Did I do something wrong? Please talk to me." Andy's hands were shaking so badly he had to grip his knees to keep them still. Tears ran down his face as he fought against every emotional instinct screaming at him to respond to his mother's pain. "How much longer?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How much longer do we have to listen to this?" I checked our GPS, feeling my own resolve wavering as the voices continued their relentless assault. The display showed our position as a small dot on that thin gray line, with miles of highway still ahead of us. 6 hours, I said. Maybe a little more. Andy closed his eyes and pressed his back against the seat. The voices outside had found their rhythm now, rotating between his mother, Sarah, Tommy, and others I couldn't identify. Each one knew exactly what to say to make him want to stop, to get out, to break the rules that were keeping us safe. The psychological pressure was wearing on me, too. Listening to Andy's torture while trying to stay focused on driving was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. My hands hurt from gripping the steering wheel, and my jaw hurt from keeping my voice steady during the endless stream of trucking facts. But I knew the worst part was still coming. The highway always saved its strongest attacks for last, and we hadn't even reached the halfway point yet. Whatever the road had planned for the final hours of our journey would make the voices calling Andy's name seem like gentle persuasion. I pressed harder on the accelerator and continued talking about tire tread depth and engine maintenance, using mundane reality as a shield against the supernatural storm raging just outside our windows. My voice had gone hoarse from hours of talking about brake maintenance and fuel systems, but I kept the steady stream of trucking knowledge flowing as Andy pressed his back against the passenger seat, eyes squeezed shut against the voices calling his name from the darkness outside. The chorus had grown quieter over the past hour, though his mother's pleading still drifted through the cab windows every few minutes, mixing with Sarah's promises and Tommy's casual invitations to hang out. The sky ahead showed the first pale hints of dawn creeping across the horizon. After 8 hours on the thin highway, we were finally approaching its end. My shoulders hurt from gripping the steering wheel, and my jaw felt locked from maintaining the constant talking that had served as Andy's lifeline through the worst of the psychological assault. "Load securement regulations require specific tie-down ratios," I continued, though my voice sounded rough and strained. 4 tie-downs minimum for loads over 10 feet, with working load limits clearly marked on all straps and chains. Andy nodded without opening his eyes, using my words as protection against the supernatural manipulation that had nearly broken him multiple times during the night. His hands stayed clenched around his knees, knuckles white from hours of tension. That's when I spotted the green sign coming out of the pale morning light ahead. "Exit 1 mile, Interstate 80 West," The end of the thin highway, normal road, normal rules, normal reality waiting just beyond that off-ramp. But the highway never let anyone leave without one final test. "Andy," I said, cutting off my lecture about cargo documentation, "open your eyes and look at me." He turned toward me, blinking against the growing daylight streaming through the windshield. His face was drawn and exhausted, aged by the night's experiences in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. "Fourth rule," I said, checking our distance to the exit. "Half a mile now. This is the most important one, so listen carefully." Andy straightened in his seat, sensing the change in my tone. "When you see your doppelganger," I said, "you drive straight through it. No stopping, no swerving, no eye contact unless absolutely necessary. The highway will show you an exact copy of yourself, and every instinct will tell you to stop. Don't." "My doppelganger," Andy's voice cracked on the word. "Your double. An exact replica, wearing your clothes, moving like you move, looking exactly like you do right now." I slowed the truck slightly as we approached the exit ramp. "It's the highway's final attempt to trap you. Most people can't handle seeing themselves standing in the road." Andy stared at me with growing alarm. "When will this happen?" The exit ramp curved ahead of us, marked by reflective signs and normal highway barriers. Standard asphalt, standard lane markings. Everything looking perfectly ordinary except for the figure standing directly in the middle of the off-ramp. "Right now," I said. Andy followed my look and went completely stiff. His exact double stood still in our path, wearing the same jeans, the same denim jacket, the same nervous expression Andy had worn when we started this trip yesterday morning. The figure's hair was messed up in the same way Andy's was after running his hands through it all night. Even the posture was identical. Weight moved to one foot, shoulders slightly hunched, hands hanging at his sides in exactly the same position. "Oh God," Andy whispered, staring at his own face, looking back at him. "That's me. That's exactly me." The doppelganger's mouth opened as Andy spoke, moving in perfect synchronization with his words. When Andy raised his hand to point at the figure, his double raised its hand at the exact same moment, creating a mirror image that defied every law of physics and common sense. "Leo, stop the truck," Andy said, his voice rising toward panic. "We can't drive through that. We can't just run over myself." "It's not you," I said firmly, maintaining our speed as we entered the curve of the off-ramp. 100 yards, Andy. Just hold on for 100 yards. But Andy wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were locked onto his doppelganger, and I could see the same paralysis taking hold that had frozen him when he saw his father's figure hours earlier. His breathing became shallow and rapid. 50 yards from the figure, Andy screamed and lunged for the steering wheel. "Stop! Stop the truck!" His hands closed around the wheel, yanking it hard to the right. "I won't let you kill me!" The truck lurched toward the shoulder as Andy fought for control, his panic giving him surprising strength. I grabbed his wrists with my right hand while trying to steer with my left, the vehicle weaving dangerously across the narrow off-ramp. "Andy, let go!" I shouted, pressing harder on the accelerator. "That's not you standing there." The doppelganger raised both hands now, as if trying to stop our approach. Its mouth moved urgently, and I realized it was speaking the same words Andy was shouting, a perfect echo of his terror and desperation. "You're going to hit me," Andy sobbed, pulling at the steering wheel with everything he had. "Please, Leo, I don't want to die." 20 yards. The figure stepped forward slightly, and I saw its face change expression to match Andy's horrified realization that we weren't stopping. The timing was perfect and deeply wrong, like watching someone's reflection move independently in a broken mirror. I used my full weight to pull the steering wheel back toward center while pinning Andy's hands against the dashboard. The truck straightened just as we reached the copy, and I felt the familiar sensation of driving through thick fog mixed with something that made my skin crawl. Andy's scream cut off abruptly as we passed through his double. For one impossible moment, I saw two Andy faces occupying the same space. one terrified and solid in the passenger seat, one calm and see-through disappearing through our windshield. Then the feeling passed, and we were rolling down normal asphalt under a normal morning sky. Andy fell against the passenger door, sobbing so hard his whole body shook. His hands covered his face as he processed what had just happened, the reality of driving through his own image, breaking something basic in his understanding of the world. I spotted a rest area sign and pulled off the interstate without saying anything. The parking lot was empty, except for a few cars and a maintenance truck near the restroom building. I shut off the engine and listened to Andy cry while the morning birds sang in the trees around us. Normal sounds from a normal world that suddenly felt strange after 8 hours on the thin highway. I climbed down from the cab and walked to the vending machines near the visitor center, feeding quarters into the coffee dispenser while Andy's sobs carried across the parking lot. The coffee was terrible, burnt, and bitter, but it tasted like reality in a way that made my hands stop shaking. When I returned to the truck, Andy had stopped crying but stayed pressed against the passenger door like he was afraid to move. His eyes were red and swollen, and his breathing still came in uneven gasps. I handed him the second cup of coffee and sat back in the driver's seat without starting the engine. We needed time to decompress before continuing towards Seattle. Time for Andy to process what he'd experienced and begin rebuilding his sense of what was real and what wasn't. "Is every trip on the thin highway like this?" Andy asked finally, his voice hoarse from crying. "Every single one," I said. "Though each driver sees different things, the highway customizes its approach based on what it finds in your head." Andy stared out at the normal rest area with its normal concrete picnic tables and normal trash cans. Everything looked solid and real and completely ordinary, which somehow made it seem more precious than it had 24 hours ago. "I thought you were going to kill me," he said quietly. When I saw myself standing there, I was completely convinced that running me over would somehow kill the real me too. That's exactly what the highway wanted you to think. I sipped the awful coffee and felt grateful for its ordinary bitterness. If you'd made me stop, we'd probably still be sitting on that off-ramp right now, trapped until the next driver came along to find our truck. Andy turned the coffee cup in his hands without drinking it. Will I ever be able to forget what I saw last night? The honest answer was no. Every driver who survived the thin highway carried those images for the rest of their lives. The faces of loved ones calling from the darkness, the sound of known voices begging for help, the impossible sight of meeting yourself on a deserted road. But Andy would learn to live with those memories the same way all of us did, by understanding that some jobs required you to see things that changed you permanently. "No," I said, "but you'll learn to live with it." We sat in silence for another 10 minutes, watching normal people walk normal dogs across normal grass under a normal morning sky. The world looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but Andy would never see it the same way again. He'd learned what existed in the spaces between mapped roads, the supernatural territories that most people never knew about, and never needed to know about. When Andy finally drank his coffee and nodded that he was ready to continue, I started the engine and pulled back onto Interstate 80. Seattle was still 6 hours away, but we'd be traveling on ordinary highway now, with ordinary traffic and ordinary rules that made sense. As we merged into the flow of morning commuters heading west, I caught myself thinking that another driver had learned the thin highway's terrible secrets and survived to tell about it. Andy would carry those memories forever, but he'd also carry the knowledge that some roads demanded more than just skill and experience. They demanded the willingness to drive through impossibilities without stopping, no matter what you saw.